The forest was alive with whispers. The creak of ancient pines swaying above, the crisp crackle of twigs beneath each cautious step, and the distant, gentle murmur of the river carving its path through the wilderness. The air carried the rich scent of moss and damp earth, sharpened by the lingering chill of early spring. Ethan Cole, his breath steady and measured, felt the familiar comfort of solitude wrapping around him. He had walked these trails countless times, finding in their untamed beauty a sanctuary from the noise of the world and the even louder echoes of his past. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a sound so raw, so primal, that it sliced through the forest's serenity like a blade. Ethan stopped cold, his ears straining. It wasn't the usual crack of branches or the distant call of a hawk. No, this was something different, something desperate. A low, guttural roar, thick with anguish and terror, rolled through the trees. His body stiffened, every nerve igniting with ancient instinct. His pulse quickened, pounding in his ears as his eyes scanned the shadows. Then he heard it, a frantic splashing, the unmistakable chaos of water fighting to swallow something that struggled against it. His boots, still mud-streaked from the trail, dug into the soft earth as he bolted toward the river, heart racing faster than his feet could carry him. The forest blurred around him, towering trunks, flashes of green, and the wild scent of pine needles crushed beneath his stride. His chest burned with each breath, but he didn't slow. Something in that cry, something beyond logic or reason, commanded him forward. Breaking through the thicket, he stumbled into a small clearing, and the scene before him slammed into his chest with the force of a hammer. The river, swollen and furious from melted mountain snow, churned in a frothing frenzy. And there, caught in its merciless grip, was a tiny, thrashing form, a bear cub, no bigger than a Labrador puppy, its panicked eyes barely above the waterline, tiny paws clawing at the current that dragged it deeper. Ethan's stomach dropped. The cub's whimper, a thin, choking gasp, hit him like a dagger, a sound so laced with terror and helplessness that it stripped away every barrier he had built inside himself. But there was more, a presence, a force behind that cry. He felt it before he saw it. On the opposite bank, the towering figure of a mother bear loomed, powerful, colossal, and trembling with a primal agony that made the ground itself seem to hold its breath. Her ears flattened against her skull, her massive paws kneading the earth as though ready to tear it apart. She roared again, the sound shaking Ethan to his bones. A mother's scream, raw and pleading, so painfully human that it seized something deep and ancient within him. Her eyes, wide and wild, locked on her flailing cub, then flicked to him. For an instant, the air between them pulsed, charged with something wordless. Fear, fury, and something else, a desperate, shattering hope. The river raged between them, a merciless judge, but Ethan's eyes were drawn to the cub, so small, so helpless, its head dipping beneath the surface, then rising, then dipping again. Its tiny mouth opened, and a soft, broken bleat escaped, barely audible over the roar of the current. The sound, fragile, hopeless, stripped Ethan down to the marrow of his soul. The water's wrathful voice screamed a brutal truth. Time was bleeding away. Ethan's eyes snapped to the fallen tree, an enormous log, weathered and bleached, spanning the river like a bridge. But it was no solid crossing, slick, jagged, and barely clinging to the banks. The water below, ravenous and black, surged hungrily against its sides. The risk was written in every shadow and every swirl. One slip, one misstep, and he would be dragged under, crushed and forgotten beneath the waves. His pulse thundered. Every instinct, every survival lesson he had ever learned, screamed, "Stay back. The mother bear is watching. The current will kill you. There's nothing you can do." But then the cub slipped under again, longer this time. Seconds passed. Too long. The tiny form bobbed back up, but weaker, limbs flailing slower, the fight ebbing from its fragile body. Ethan's throat tightened, and the world compressed to a single, blinding point of clarity. You can't let it die. The words weren't a thought. They were a command, primal and absolute. Before his mind could catch up, his body had already moved, boots slamming onto the slick bark of the fallen tree. The log moaned beneath him, shifting ominously. His arms shot out, fingers clawing for balance as his heart jackhammered against his ribs. The river bellowed beneath, its cold breath licking at his ankles. The next step came, then another, each one slow, each one a whispered bargain with gravity. The cub sputtered, its tiny body spinning helplessly in the torrent, and Ethan felt his chest crush inward. The distance, still too far, his knees bent, muscles coiling. And then he lunged. His body crashed down, the bark scraping his arms raw, his chest slamming hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs. His hand shot out, fingers stretching, burning, just as the cub tumbled past. Contact. A fleeting brush of wet fur. Then gone. No. His voice ripped from his throat, but his arm, driven by something beyond human strength, plunged deeper. His fingers closed, warm, sodden, trembling, around the tiny, fragile body. The cub's paw, barely the size of his palm, clutched back, its claws pressing against his skin in desperate reflex. The log groaned again, a deep, guttural crack, and Ethan's stomach plunged. The current tugged at his legs, furious at his defiance. His body screamed with exertion, muscles shaking, lungs searing. With a final, agonizing heave, he wrenched the cub from the river's teeth and hauled it onto his chest, his body collapsing against the tree with the force of the save. Water streamed from the cub's tiny form, its eyes wide and wild, its chest fluttering with panicked gasps. For a beat, the world stood utterly still. Just the thunder of his pulse and the frantic rise and fall of the cub's breath against his soaked shirt. A shadow fell over them. He looked up. The mother bear had crossed, impossibly fast, her colossal frame inches from the log's edge. Her ears were pricked forward, her massive chest heaving. Ethan felt the weight of her gaze, molten, ancient, a force that could crush him without a single swipe. His own chest tightened with the raw, undeniable knowledge. She could kill him, right now, and no one would ever know. But she didn't move. The space between them, fragile as gossamer, pulsed with something neither human nor animal could fully name. Her eyes, wild and blazing, met his. And in them, Ethan saw something that should not have been possible. Not in a predator, not in a creature of the wild. Recognition, not of form or face, but of something far deeper. Of risk, of sacrifice, of love. The wind howled, the river screamed, but between them, there was only silence. And in that silence, something passed, a thread, invisible but unbreakable. The bear stepped forward. The air in Ethan's lungs turned solid. His body screamed to move, to run, to fight. But he didn't. He couldn't. His arms, though burning with exhaustion, folded closer around the cub's fragile body, not in defiance. In offering, the bear's massive muzzle lowered, close enough that he felt the warmth of her breath against his skin. She paused. Then, with a slowness that felt sacred, her nose brushed the cub's damp fur. The cub's tiny body stirred, then wriggled, a weak but living sign. And from the bear's throat came a sound Ethan would never forget, a low, vibrating rumble, not of threat, but of something else. Something raw and ancient and impossible. A mother's relief. The bear's eyes lifted to his one final time, and for a breathless instant, the boundaries of species, of language, of fear, all collapsed. Only one truth remained, two souls, bound by a single, selfless act. Then, with infinite gentleness, Ethan loosened his hold. The cub, as if understanding, clambered from his arms, wobbling unsteadily on the log before making its way back to its mother's colossal frame. The bear's massive shoulder brushed past him, warm, solid, and terrifyingly alive. And then she was gone, the cub nestled at her side, vanishing into the shivering forest shadows. The river still roared. The wind still howled. But for Ethan, there was only silence. And in that silence, something he hadn't felt in years bloomed painfully in his chest. Purpose. But as he lay there, chest heaving, limbs trembling, he felt the air shift again. The hairs on his neck rose. And in the quiet aftermath of the rescue, something, unseen, was coming. And it was far from over. The world was a storm of chaos and sound, roaring water, the groan of the bending log, and the thunder of Ethan's own heartbeat, crashing so violently in his chest that he could feel it in his throat. The river, swollen with spring's icy vengeance, screamed beneath him, a monstrous force that cared nothing for courage, for life, or for the fragile body clutched against his chest. The cub's tiny frame, soaked and trembling, pressed against him, its rapid, shallow breaths fluttering against his shirt. Its eyes, wide black and glazed with terror, blinked up at him, uncomprehending but pleading in a language older than words. Water streamed from its fur, each droplet shimmering briefly before being swallowed by the abyss below. It was so light, so impossibly small, but the weight of what it carried, the raw, primal will to survive, crushed Ethan's chest far more than its fragile body ever could. But there was no time to feel, no time to breathe. The log beneath him trembled violently, a beast beneath his feet, warning of its impending collapse. His palms, scraped and bloodied, pressed against the rough bark as he fought to balance, his boots slipping on the moss-slick surface. Cold, biting wind howled past, tearing at his soaked clothes, and the river roared louder, as though enraged at having been denied its prey. A guttural, primal sound broke through the madness, a roar so full of raw agony it felt like the earth itself was mourning. His eyes snapped up. The mother bear, she was closer now, having crossed the bank with impossible speed. Massive paws carved trenches into the mud, and her towering frame trembled with tension, every muscle a coiled spring of maternal fury and desperation. Her ears were flattened, her mouth pulled back to reveal teeth the size of daggers, but it was her eyes, those burning amber eyes, that seized Ethan's breath. They blazed with more than rage. They bled with pain, with terror, with the helpless agony of a mother watching her child, inches from death, and being powerless to reach it. A mother's scream without a voice. Ethan's body screamed at him to run. The primal part of his brain, the part buried deep in every human since the dawn of time, roared, "She will kill you." She would be on him in seconds, and her wrath would be absolute. And yet he didn't move, because something deeper, something raw and unbreakable, rooted him to the spot. It was the same anguish, because he had felt it before. A memory, uninvited, unwanted, surged up from the depths, crashing into him with the force of the river. Another scream, one human this time, a frozen lake. His son's tiny hand slipping beneath the ice. Ethan's throat closed, and his grip around the cub tightened, as if the memory could steal this one from him too. The log shuddered beneath him again, and a sharp crack split the air. His heart seized. The jagged moan of splintering would fill his ears. A warning, a promise. The log was dying beneath him, seconds from breaking, from plunging him and the cub into the ravenous jaws of the current. The mother bear moved, half a step forward, her massive paws digging into the earth, her muscles screaming with the desire to act. But she stopped, just barely, torn between her instincts and the impossible, unbearable knowledge that her next step could drive him into the river with her cub. Her body trembled with the agony of restraint. She was a force of nature, a goddess of power and fury. But in this moment, she was something far greater. She was a mother. The air between them, thick with terror, with fury, with heartbreak, seemed to pulse with something ancient. She could kill him, and he knew she would, if it meant saving her child. But Ethan felt it. the impossible war raging in her body, the primal violence locked in battle with something deeper. Trust. The log screamed again, a hideous, splintering shriek. Ethan's instincts roared, move. His legs burned, his muscles seizing from cold and terror. His eyes flicked from the bear to the shore, to the tree line behind her. Too far, too impossible. Then back to the cub. Its breath hitched, its body shivering violently, life flickering. The choice was a blade against his throat, a knife through his ribs. If he stayed, he would die. If he moved, the cub would be lost. And if he failed, the mother. The log cracked, the splinter racing through its heart like lightning. Move. Ethan lunged. His body screamed as his legs pushed, his boots finding purchase on the slick bark for a fraction of a second, then slipping, his balance vanishing beneath him. The world flipped, sky and river trading places, and cold, unimaginable cold, ripped through his side as one leg plunged into the current. The river seized him, a clawed hand pulling, tearing, and he felt the log roll beneath him. But his arm held, fingers clawing, nails shredding. He clung to the bark with everything he had left, his body dangling above the void, and the cub, blessedly, still against his chest, his other arm locked around it with a grip forged from something beyond human. The roar of the river became a deafening scream, and Ethan's lungs burned as cold shot up his leg, numbing his flesh to ice. The log groaned, a dying giant, and began to tilt too far. A shadow fell over him, massive, looming, and then the log stopped. Ethan's heart, his breath, his world froze. The mother bear's paw, colossal, powerful enough to end his life with a twitch, pressed into the trunk, but not in rage, in force, in balance. Her claws sank deep into the bark, anchoring it. Her muscles, those same muscles built for destruction, strained, flexing beneath her fur as she fought against the river's pull. The log, trembling but held, ceased its death roll. Ethan's breath hitched, his frozen fingers shaking. She wasn't saving him. She was saving her child. His arm burned, every muscle screaming in agony, but he shifted, slow, trembling, and with infinite care, until his knee found the bark again. With a final, gasping cry, he pushed himself upward, his body heaving, the cub cradled tight. And then, they were on the log together. The mother bear, her breath a cloud of heat in the frozen air, loomed so close that Ethan could feel the warmth radiating from her massive body. Her eyes, fire and amber, pierced into him, blazing, unblinking. His entire body locked, every muscle taut with the certainty of death. And yet, the bear did not move. The cub, weak and shivering, gave a soft, broken whimper. The sound sliced through the air like a plea, and for a heartbeat, everything else, the roaring river, the screaming wind, ceased to exist. The bear's gaze dropped to the fragile life in his arms. Ethan felt his chest crush inward. He couldn't hold on. The cold, the exhaustion, it was devouring him, and the cub's tiny heartbeat, fluttering like a fragile bird against his chest, was growing weaker. And so, without thought, without hesitation, he offered. His arms, trembling, his body broken, extended the cub toward her. The air between them, thick with tension and terror, seemed to stop. The bear's nostrils flared, her chest expanding with a breath so deep it felt like the earth inhaling. She lowered her head, slowly, so slowly, until her massive nose touched the cub's soaked fur. A low, rumbling sound, soft, vibrating with something ancient, rose from her throat. And then her teeth, each one a dagger, closed, not on him, but around the cub, gently, so impossibly gently, like a whisper made of strength. She took her child. The warmth left Ethan's arms, and he collapsed forward, his body crashing onto the log, his chest heaving, his vision swimming with exhaustion and something he couldn't name. The bear, her child safely in her grasp, stood motionless. Her eyes met his one final time, and in them, Not violence, not threat, but something Ethan would never be able to explain. Something that would haunt him, asterisk, and heal him, asterisk, for the rest of his life. Then she turned, her massive frame moving with a grace that defied her power, and vanished into the shadows, her cub cradled against her mighty chest. The wind roared, the river screamed, the forest, vast and eternal, held its breath. And Ethan, chest heaving, heart breaking, body shaking, felt something else. A tremor, not in his chest, but beneath him. The log cracked, and this time there was no saving it. The world collapsed into chaos. The thunderous crack of the log splintering beneath him split the air, a sound so sharp and final it seemed to tear through the very fabric of the forest. For an instant, time slowed, the universe pausing to witness what would come next. Then gravity seized Ethan in a cold, merciless grip, and he fell. The icy river struck him like a fist, stealing the breath from his lungs in a violent gasp. The cold was beyond pain, an immediate, all-consuming numbness that sank its claws into his bones and threatened to extinguish every flicker of warmth within him. The current roared, a monstrous voice drowning out every other sound as it enveloped him in its frigid embrace. The world above vanished, the sky, the trees, the air, replaced by a suffocating swirl of darkness and icy torrents. His limbs flailed, but the river was relentless, twisting and pulling him as though eager to swallow him whole. The weight of his soaked clothes dragged him downward, and his body, numb, burning, and disobedient, refused to answer his desperate commands. But he wasn't alone. A flash of sodden fur, a tiny gasp breaking through the water. The cub, the instinct that had driven him onto that cursed log, roared louder than his fear. His arm shot out through the churning black, his frozen fingers clawing at the water until contact. The cub's small, slick body pressed into his palm, and in that instant, everything else, the terror, the cold, the crushing darkness, fell away. His arm closed around the trembling form, drawing it to his chest, where he could feel its fragile heartbeat, a wild, rapid flutter, like the wings of a trapped bird. The river, furious at being denied its prize, struck harder. The current slammed him against something solid, a submerged rock, ripping the breath from his body and forcing the cub briefly from his grasp. Ethan's arm shot out again, and his fingers caught a hind leg, holding on with a grip forged from desperation. His body screamed, lungs burning, limbs trembling, darkness edging his vision. But he would not let go. The water spun them mercilessly, and his head struck something hard. Pain exploded through his skull, and for a moment, the world flickered and dimmed. His mouth opened in a silent cry, and cold rushed in, filling him, burning down his throat and into his lungs with a searing, hollow agony. But still, he clutched the cub, his arm locking around its tiny frame with a strength that was no longer his own. "You're not taking this one," something inside him snarled, a voice older than his fear, older than the river, older than death itself. The current surged again, dragging them both into a narrow, rock-lined channel where the water frothed and howled with lethal intent. Jagged stones tore at his clothes, his skin, but he barely felt it through the ice, seeping into every inch of his body. His vision blurred, the world reduced to dark shapes and violent movement, until suddenly they were airborne. The current spat them out like broken branches, sending them crashing into a shallow pool downstream. Ethan hit the water hard, his body folding and rolling, the cub still clutched in his arms. The world spun and shattered, and then silence. The river moved on without them, its hunger satisfied, its roar fading into a distant, indifferent murmur. For a moment, there was nothing. Then pain, a searing, blinding agony as his lungs convulsed, forcing out the icy water in a violent, racking cough. His body shook uncontrollably, every muscle locking in a desperate fight to reclaim warmth. His chest burned, his throat raw and broken, but the cub, his arms, numb and leaden, searched against the cold, slick ground. His fingers trembling and white, found fur, drenched and limp. No. His voice, barely more than a hoarse whisper, broke on the word. His body rebelled as he pulled the tiny form closer, his trembling hand pressing against its chest. No movement, no breath. "Come on," his voice cracked, and something inside him, something vital, began to crack with it. "Come on, little one." His fingers, stiff and shaking, rubbed the cub's chest in quick, desperate motions. His lips, blue and trembling, opened again, and he breathed. The air, shallow and fragile, passed from his lungs into the cub's tiny mouth. Again and again. "Please," he rasped, his voice breaking into the cold. "Come back, please." The world, vast and uncaring, seemed to shrink until it was only this, only them. A man, a cub, a fight. The silence was unbearable. It pressed against his ears, against his ribs, against his heart. His shaking hands pressed harder, too hard, against the tiny chest, his voice cracking into something broken. "Don't leave me." Then, a shudder, the smallest of gasps, so faint, so fragile, it could have been imagined. Then, a cough, a tiny, wet splutter. Ethan's body sagged with a relief, so fierce it stole his breath all over again. His eyes, raw and burning, watched as the cub's chest rose, shallow, weak, but alive. His lips trembled, and the sound that escaped him was somewhere between a sob and a broken laugh. "There you are." His hand, shaking and cold, brushed back the matted fur from the cub's tiny, fragile face. The cub's eyes, dark, wide and blinking, opened, and in them, the whole world. But then a shadow, a sound, a low, guttural rumble, a vibration through the earth that shook the marrow of his bones. Ethan's head, heavy and fogged with exhaustion, lifted, and his heart, still fragile from the battle it had barely survived, stopped. The mother bear, massive, imposing, her towering frame blocked the fading daylight, her breath visible in slow, heavy clouds. Her eyes, burning like embers, were locked on him. Her nostrils flared, tasting the air, tasting his scent, and the low, rolling sound from her chest grew. A warning, a threat, a reckoning. Ethan's body, broken and shaking, refused to move. His mind screamed for him to run, but he could not. There was nowhere to go, nothing left in him to flee. And in his arms, the reason for her wrath. The cub stirred weakly, a soft whimper escaping its tiny lips. And the mother took a step. The earth beneath her enormous paws trembled, and the sound in her throat deepened, a sound so primal, so ancient, it seemed to reach into the core of the earth itself. Ethan felt it resonate in his bones, every instinct screaming that this was the end. But his arms, on instinct, tightened around the cub, not in defiance, not in threat, in protection. His voice, raw and broken, barely a whisper, escaped through trembling lips. "I saved your baby." The bear's ears flicked, subtle, but there. Her enormous chest heaved with a breath that carried 1,000 unspoken things. Ethan's fingers, still pressed to the cub's fur, felt the soft, trembling beat of its heart, and his own, shattered and breaking, whispered to her without words, "I know what it is to lose. Please, not this one." The bear's muscles, tense and carved from raw power, seemed to pause. Her eyes, burning and ancient, read something in his face, something that wasn't predator, something that wasn't enemy. A mother and a man standing on the same sacred, breaking ground. The air between them, thick, cold, and charged with something more than instinct, held. Then the bear moved, slowly, so slowly. Her colossal frame lowered. The earth groaned beneath her weight as her massive muzzle drew near. Ethan's heart, a fragile, fractured thing, nearly stopped as he felt the heat of her breath, each exhale a whisper of life and death against his skin. The cub, sensing the presence that had carried it from the moment of its birth, whimpered softly. And the mother answered, a low, resonant rumble, deep and ancient, not of threat, but of something far more primal, recognition. Her massive nose, so powerful it could shatter bone with a single swipe, brushed against a cub's fur, soft, tender, impossibly gentle. The cub stirred weakly, and in that motion, Ethan felt the universe shift. The bear's eyes, once wild with rage, lifted his one final time, and in them, a language without words, a mother's relief, a mother's gratitude, a mother's promise. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, but in the stillness, the earth betrayed them, a sound deep, rumbling, far beneath. The ground, weakened by the river's wrath, shuddered, and then, with a roar, it collapsed. The earth roared. The ground beneath Ethan's broken body convulsed, a monstrous, groaning protest, as if the forest itself were tearing apart. For one terrifying instant, the world seemed to hold its breath, and then collapse. The riverbank, weakened and ravaged by the relentless current, surrendered with a deafening crack. Earth, roots, and ancient stone gave way, plunging into the water in a chaotic avalanche. The earth beneath Ethan, the bear, and her cub shattered into a crumbling maw. Ethan felt his body drop, weightless, helpless, his stomach twisting in free fall. The cold, sharp air ripped past his face as the world became a blur of earth, sky, and shadows. His hands, raw and trembling, clawed instinctively for something, anything, to stop the fall. And then impact. His body struck hard earth with a bone-rattling thud. A cry, part pain, part shock, ripped from his throat as his shoulder crunched against the rocks, white-hot agony detonating through his side. His ribs screamed, perhaps broken, as he tumbled, earth and debris chasing him like an avalanche of claws. But he wasn't the only one falling. A massive shadow, fur, muscle, and primal power, crashed down beside him. The mother bear, her body struck with thunderous force, her massive frame rolling through the dirt in a brutal, bone-crushing tumble. The ground trembled beneath her, and an ear-splitting roar, raw, pained, and defiant, tore from her throat. And then, a sound that shattered the air and pierced through every other noise. The cub, a tiny, weak cry, lost and alone in the choking cloud of earth and ruin. Ethan's chest seized. His battered body screamed for stillness, for surrender, but the sound of that cry, so fragile, so desperate, ignited something far stronger than pain. His eyes, bloodied and burning, darted through the storm of dust. Through the chaos, a small shape, partially buried under a twisted lattice of roots and crumbling earth. The cub, Ethan moved. His muscles, broken and disobedient, answered not from instinct, but from something deeper, an ache that came from his very soul. His knees scraped against the jagged rocks as he crawled, his fingers clawing through the dirt, splinters stabbing into his palms. The cub's body was still, too still. Earth clung to its tiny form, and its breaths, if there were any, were shallow and strained. No, no, no. Ethan's voice cracked, his throat raw and shredded. His hands, trembling and caked with mud, pushed and pulled at the debris with frantic, savage strength. And then, a low sound, a rumble. Behind him, Ethan froze, the blood in his veins turning cold. The air around him shifted, heavy with something primal, something ancient, a force that lived in the marrow of the earth and the roots of the trees. The mother bear, her breath, deep and guttural, rumbled through the dirt and the dust. He could feel it warm, rhythmic, against the back of his neck. His body stiffened, every muscle locking, as his mind screamed a singular, terrible truth. She thinks I've taken her cub. The air pulsed with danger. His battered heart, so close to giving out, hammered with a desperate question. Run. But where? His eyes flicked to the cub, so small, so fragile, half buried in the earth. Leave it. No, never. His hand, trembling, moved, slow, deliberate, toward the cub's body. He felt the bear shift behind him, the earth crunching beneath her colossal weight. The deep, rumbling growl, the sound of raw, maternal warning, vibrated through his bones. But his fingers did not stop. They reached, through fear, through pain, until they pressed against the cub's tiny chest. No movement. His own chest crushed inward. His palm, shaking, filthy, desperate, pressed against the cub's side. His thumb slid to its mouth, wiping clear the clinging mud. "Come on!" His voice, a whisper, broken and pleading, fought through cracked lips. "Come back." The bear's growl deepened, a rolling storm ready to break. But Ethan did not stop. His lips, shaking and pale, pressed together, and he breathed, soft, shallow, fragile, breath against breath. Once, twice. His voice, a cracked whisper, broke into the air. "Stay with her. She needs you." The bear's growl faltered, just for a heartbeat. Then, the tiniest gasp, a stuttering, fragile breath, so faint it felt like the forest itself exhaled. The cub's chest, small, weak, rose, and then fell, then rose again. Ethan's heart, shattered, spent, swelled with something that no word could capture. His body sagged forward, his hand cradling the cub's small, living warmth. But a sound, deeper than any growl, shook the air. Ethan's broken body seized as he felt the earth shift beneath him, felt the bear move, and then warmth. A massive, coarse muzzle, scarred and powerful, pressed not in fury, but in claim. The mother's nose brushed against her cub, parting Ethan's fingers not with force, but with the unmistakable tenderness of a mother retrieving her child. Ethan's trembling hands, reluctant, yet yielding, released the fragile body. The cub, now pressed into the heat of its mother's colossal frame, gave a weak, barely audible whimper. And from the bear, a sound Ethan would never, in all his life, forget. Not a growl, not a roar, a rumble, low, soft, and raw. A mother's relief, a mother's gratitude. Ethan's body, spent and shattered, gave way. His knees collapsed beneath him, and his palms, torn and bloodied, pressed into the cold earth as his body folded forward, his forehead touching the dirt. His chest heaved, part sob, part breath. His eyes squeezed tight against a surge of something too enormous, too sacred to bear. He felt her presence, still towering, still monstrous. But in that moment, there was no threat, only recognition, only something shared, raw and wordless, between a man and a mother who had both fought against the tide of death for something they could not live without. The earth, wounded and broken, settled into an aching silence around them. The river, distant and cruel, moved on, its hunger spent. The trees, towering witnesses, stood solemn and still. Ethan, shaking and breathless, opened his eyes, just as the bear, her cub nestled close, began to move. The earth trembled softly beneath her massive steps as she turned, her colossal frame vanishing into the veil of trees, her cub, alive and safe, cradled against her side. But before she was gone, she stopped. The great, ancient head turned, and the amber eyes, glowing and raw with everything words could never say. Metish, for a single, infinite heartbeat, a farewell, a recognition, a thank you. And then she was gone. The forest, vast and eternal, swallowed her whole, leaving only the scars in the earth. And Ethan, alone, shaking, his body broken, but his heart whole. He gasped, the air ragged and cold, but alive. Yet, in the aching silence, as his head fell back against the earth and his eyes fluttered closed, something new, something wrong, pierced through the fog of his exhaustion. A sound, faint, mechanical, the unmistakable click of a camera, and a presence, unseen. watching. The air was thick, too still, too heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The chaos had passed. The earth had stopped groaning. The river had reclaimed its voice, distant and cold. But in the silence, something else was present, something unseen. Ethan's body, broken and battered, lay motionless against the damp earth. His lungs, raw and burning, strained for each shallow breath. His heart pounded, a dull, heavy throb, as if it struggled to decide whether to stop or fight on. His skin, torn and bruised, clung to the icy mud. The taste of blood, coppery and metallic, lingered on his lips. But none of it, the pain, the cold, the exhaustion, none of it was as sharp as the sound that pierced through the trees. A click, soft, subtle, but unmistakable. The sound of a camera shutter. Ethan's eyes, swollen and blurred, snapped open. His body screamed in protest, but his instincts roared louder. His head turned, slow, agonizing, and through the haze of pain and earth dust he saw it. A figure, a man, partially obscured by the trees, cloaked in shadow, still and watching. A camera raised, its lens a cold, unblinking eye. Ethan's heart seized. His body, broken but defiant, jolted with something hot and sharp. Fear. No. Anger. The stranger stood, silent and motionless, like a predator in the underbrush, observing without interfering. There was no urgency in his stance, no panic, only calculation. Another click. The camera's lens lowered slightly, revealing a face, rugged, weathered by the wild, and utterly expressionless. Eyes sharp and cold. No empathy, no awe, just observation. The anger in Ethan's chest, fragile as his breath, sparked hotter. His voice, cracked and raw, barely pushed through his throat. Who are you? The man didn't answer, didn't move. His finger hovered near the shutter. His head tilted, a small, almost curious gesture, as if Ethan himself were part of the scenery. A specimen, a subject. Ethan's fingers twitched against the earth, clawing into the mud as if trying to drag himself forward, though his body refused. The earth felt like it was swallowing him whole, cold, clinging, relentless. But his eyes, burning and unbroken, never left the stranger. The weight of everything, the fight, the river, the bear, the cub, crushed down on him, and in his chest, something snapped. His voice, raw, shaking, forced itself free. You watched? His lips trembled, his teeth clenched against the agony in his ribs. You just... The words shattered in his throat, splintering into something between a gasp and a sob. The man's eyes, cold, remote, flicked briefly to the ground where the mother bear's tracks still pressed deep into the earth, where the impression of her massive form and the cub's fragile imprint remained. His expression didn't change. Another click. The lens turned, this time, not toward Ethan, but toward the tracks. Ethan's body surged with a raw, feral heat. Pain screamed through his shattered bones, but he moved. His palms slammed against the earth as he tried to push himself up, the tendons in his arms straining, shaking violently under his own broken weight. His voice, hoarse and furious, tore free. You stood there. His breath hitched, ragged, barely staying in his throat. You watched her. The earth swayed beneath him, the sky spinning in a dizzying whirl of trees and gray. His body screamed to collapse, to stop, but something deeper, something primal, forced him to his knees. The stranger lowered his camera. Slowly. You risk your life, the man said, his voice low and smooth, almost clinical, for a bear cub. His head tilted, eyes cold and dissecting, knowing she could have killed you. Ethan's body shook, his limbs barely holding him from crumbling completely. His voice, broken but fierce, rasped. She was a mother. His chest heaved, each breath a knife through his ribs. And he was her baby. The man's eyes, sharp, unblinking, watched him, but there was something detached in them. No understanding, no recognition of the weight in Ethan's words. Only curiosity. Ethan's blood, hot despite the ice in his veins, seared through his broken body. His jaw, scraped and stained with dirt and blood, clenched as his lips pressed tight into a line. His voice, cracked and trembling, burned through the cold. You didn't care. His eyes, bright and sharp despite the pain, locked on the stranger's face. You watched and you. His voice faltered, but he forced it back, raw, like torn bark over an open wound. You wanted the shot more than you wanted to help. A silence, thick and cold, settled between them. The forest, vast and ageless, seemed to listen. The man's fingers, resting against his camera, flexed slightly. His lips, thin and unreadable, parted, but his voice, when it came, carried no warmth. I don't interfere. His eyes narrowed, their pale, steely depths reflecting the broken man before him. I document what is. The words, flat, clinical, surgical, cut deeper than any claw or current. Ethan's chest, cracked and caving, heaved with something bitter and raw. His voice, trembling and shattered, pushed through clenched teeth. She didn't need you to interfere, he spat, his voice shaking with fury and something deeper, something aching. She needed you to care. The stranger's gaze, sharp as broken glass, remained steady. And you cared enough for both of us, he said, his voice low, almost amused. Ethan's body, spent, shattered, seized with the rawness of it. His lips, cracked and cold, trembled as his voice broke, soft but burning. You stood in the shadows, and you took. His throat closed, but the words fought free. You took, while she fought. His voice, tight and quaking with something on the edge of breaking, seared the air. While we fought. His head bowed, his chest racked, but his words, soft and ragged, cut through the stillness. She trusted me. The silence after those words felt endless. The man, his face etched in cold stone, watched him. His finger hovered over the shutter, hesitant, still. And for a moment, the camera lowered completely. But then, a snap, not from the camera, from the underbrush. The stranger's head turned, sharp and immediate. His posture stiffened, the distant cold in his eyes flickering into something else. Something alert. Ethan, his body trembling on the brink of collapse, felt it too, a shift, a presence. The forest, vast and ancient, had gone, too silent. The air, cold and thin, carried something beneath its skin. And then, a low sound, deep, vibrating through the earth. Not the mother bear, something else. The stranger's eyes, for the first time, narrowed, not in cold curiosity, but in recognition. The camera, long a shield and a weapon, dropped to his chest. His body, still, predator sleek, shifted, but it wasn't Ethan he was watching anymore. The eyes of a hunter, fixed on something behind him. Ethan, his battered heart seizing, felt the breath in his throat freeze as the shadows in the trees moved. The silence was wrong. Not the peaceful kind that lingers after chaos, but the kind that suffocates, thick, expectant, and alive. The forest, which moments ago had been a chorus of wind and water, stood frozen in breathless anticipation. Even the river, ever restless, seemed to whisper more than roar, as if warning, as if watching. Ethan felt it before he saw it, that ancient primal instinct, the one that lived in the marrow of bones older than memory, screamed through his battered body. Every hair on his neck stood erect. His skin, already cold from the river, turned colder still, a different kind of cold. Not from the air, but from something near. The man with the camera, still half shrouded in shadows, was no longer watching Ethan. His eyes, sharp and flint-like, had shifted. His posture, once relaxed and predatory, had tightened, every muscle coiling with a readiness that no lens could capture. The camera, once his weapon, now hung forgotten against his chest, swinging softly with his breath. Because something else was there, the snap of a branch, so faint, so deliberate, cracked through the stillness. Ethan's heart, already fragile, stuttered painfully. His eyes, heavy-lidded with exhaustion, dragged toward the sound. The underbrush, thick, dark, and moving. A shape, barely visible through the web of trees and leaves. Massive, low, and silent. The stranger's voice, low, tight, and stripped of all cold detachment, cut the air. Don't move. The authority in his tone was sharp, like a blade pressed to the throat of a moment. But beneath it, barely audible, lurked something else. Worry. Ethan's body was already refusing him, shaking violently from a fight that had taken every piece of him. His breath, ragged and shallow, wheezed through cracked lips. He couldn't have moved if he wanted to. And then, from the shadows, two eyes, not amber, not the warm, burning gold of the mother bear he had faced, but cold, flat, like frozen obsidian. A predator's eyes. A wolf. But not just a wolf. This was something older, larger. The kind of creature that had ruled these lands long before men carved their names into maps and claimed them. Its fur, thick and matted, rippled as it stepped into the light, the heavy muscles beneath it shifting like liquid shadow. Its breath, visible in the cold air, came slow, calm. But its eyes, locked onto Ethan's broken form with a hunger that was neither rushed nor reckless. A hunter's hunger. A predator that had already decided. Ethan felt his body betray him, his chest tightening, his limbs trembling from more than cold. He tried, he tried, to steady his breath, but fear had its claws in his throat. He felt the weight of those eyes, felt the measure in them. The wolf knew. It knew he was weak. It knew he couldn't run. And it knew that he wouldn't fight back. A faint, guttural growl, low and resonant, vibrated from the beast's throat. A sound of certainty, a declaration. But then, another voice, human, but cold as the wolf's eyes. Back away. The man with the camera had shifted, not backward, but forward. His hand, slow and steady, slipped into his jacket. There was something in the controlled smoothness of it. A predator recognizing another. A hunter readying for the kill. Ethan's shattered breath scraped from his throat. No. His voice, weak, broken, barely made it through the air. No, don't. The stranger's eyes, sharp, cold, flicked toward him. There was no compassion in them, only assessment. You're bleeding, he said flatly. And you're down. That makes you pray. His fingers, steady and practiced, closed around something cold and metallic inside his coat. A shape, a silhouette of a grip. But I'm not. The wolf's ears flicked, registering the shift in tone. Its eyes, dark and knowing, flicked between the two men. Ethan felt it, like a second heartbeat under his skin. This wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. The wolf, like the bear before it, was weighing the world in a language older than words. But Ethan, his body ruined, his heart raw, felt something else. The wolf wasn't just measuring threat. It was measuring loss. Because in its eyes, beneath the cold hunger, something flickered. A shadow that mirrored his own. Ethan's lips, cracked and trembling, parted again, his voice barely a breath. It's alone. The stranger didn't look away from his target. His voice, taut and cold, replied, "That's nature." Ethan's body, shattered but defiant, burned with something raw. His voice, cracked and breaking, rasped, "That's grief." The stranger's jaw tightened, but the wolf paused. Ethan's chest heaved, his voice trembling, but fierce with something that pain could not silence. She fought for her cub. His breath was shaking, his words jagged as glass. "You watch her watched us." His voice cracked, and for a heartbeat, he felt the weight of the cub's fragile body in his arms again, felt its stuttering breath. "And she let me live." The wolf's ears flicked. The cold eyes, still, calculating, listened. Ethan's voice, weak but unbroken, pressed through the air. "If you shoot," his throat clenched, his breath a broken thing, "all you do is make another." The stranger's hand, still pressed to his weapon, did not move, but the wolf, its gaze broke, just for a second, away from the stranger and back to Ethan. The breath between them, man and beast, was thin, and in the air between them, the pulse of something raw, not mercy, not fear, recognition, the kind only shared between those who know what it is to lose. The wolf shifted, its massive head lowering, muscles still tight with instinct, turned away from Ethan. The deep, ragged breath it released steamed into the air, an exhale not of submission, but of choice. The great beast's body tensed once, coiled muscle, raw and alive, then vanished into the shadow, silent as smoke, gone. The stillness that followed was deafening. The forest, silent. The river, waiting. Only the breath of two men remained, but the sound of metal, the gun, half drawn from its holster, now returned. The stranger's eyes, sharp and cold, fixed on Ethan with something unreadable. "You," he said slowly, his voice a blade on stone, "are something I can't figure out." Ethan's body, torn and spent, felt the darkness of exhaustion rising. His vision blurred, his lips parted, but his eyes never left the stranger's. And in them, a truth so raw, so simple, that no lens could ever capture. "I didn't come here to be figured out." The stranger's lips, tight and thin, twitched, not in a smile, in something else. But before Ethan's body collapsed, before the earth finally took him, the stranger's voice, low and certain, pressed one final word through the air. "Good." But as the blackness claimed Ethan, and the world slipped, the wind brought a new sound, distant, faint, but unmistakable, and coming closer. The whirring of blades, a helicopter, and with it, something far colder than any predator in the trees. The sound cut through the trees, unnatural, foreign, wrong. A low, rhythmic thumping, distant at first, but growing, each rotation slicing the air with surgical precision. The sky, once a dome of bruised clouds, seemed to pulse with it, the sound crawling through the trees and into the bones of the earth. A helicopter, Ethan, his body shattered and sinking into the cold earth, barely registered it. His breaths, ragged, shallow, escaped him like fleeting wisps of life. His eyes, half-lidded, fluttered in and out of darkness. The forest blurred, a patchwork of shadows and gray sky, his vision fractured by pain and exhaustion. But the sound, that sound, would not let him fall. His pulse, weak and strained, began to race, not from relief, from something darker, dread. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump grew, slicing through the canopy until the sky above was no longer just gray, but rotored, streaked with metal and shadow. The helicopter breached the treeling, a mechanical predator, its frame matte and faceless, black as a raven's wing. No markings, no names, no symbols, only the cold, spinning eye of the searchlight that burst from its underbelly, white and sterile, too bright for the forest's ancient shadows. Ethan's body, though ruined, reacted. His fingers twitched into the mud, clawing at the earth like an animal trying to burrow away from a hunter's gaze. His chest, crushed and screaming, seized with panic, his breath coming faster, sharper, because he knew this wasn't rescue. The blinding column of light swept across the earth, cutting through the trees, obliterating the forest's sacred secrecy. The silence, the one that had held grief, struggle, and life, shattered beneath the mechanical roar. The beam passed over the scarred earth, the clawed trenches of the bear's struggle, the faint, fading prints of the cub. Then it found him. The light hit his broken body with the cold precision of a scalpel. Ethan's eyes, burning and bloodshot, clenched against the searing white, but his body, betrayed by instinct, tried to move. His arm, shaking and torn, scraped against the earth, trying, futilely, to drag himself from the glare. His lips, cracked and raw, barely formed the word, "No." The light, merciless, clinical, held. And then, a voice, cold, metallic, inhuman. It fractured the forest with its jagged edge, pouring from a loudspeaker. "Stay where you are." The command was stripped of humanity, flattened into something sterile, devoid of life or empathy. But Ethan did. His body, a ruin of torn muscle and shattered bone, fought. His arm, raw and trembling, dug into the earth, his fingernails breaking as they pulled at the mud. His ribs, broken, screamed with every inch. His knee, shredded and unstable, buckled as he tried to rise. His breath, wheezing, shallow, fought against the weight of his own body. Because something, something, was screaming inside him. "Get up." The voice thundered again, cold and exacting. "Remain where you are. Do not." A new sound, boots, crunching against the forest floor. Not one, many. Shadows moved beneath the trees, men, clad in slate gray, their silhouettes armored and faceless beneath helmets and visors. They emerged from the darkness like phantoms, their presence a violation of the wilderness's raw, sacred heart. Their hands, gloved and mechanical, cradled weapons that belonged to war zones, not forests. Their movements, swift, silent, were without question. Ethan felt his heart, broken as it was rage. His body screamed, every inch of him torn, ruined, and he moved, because he knew they weren't here for him. The camera, his head, sluggish and pounding, snapped sideways, toward the trees, toward him, the stranger. But the shadows, the armed phantoms, were already there. The man with the camera, once the predator, once the observer, stood frozen, his sharp, cold eyes now calculating something else. The lens, which had stolen moments without remorse, now saw something he did not control. And the phantoms saw him. The nearest one, his movements cold and practiced, raised a weapon, not to kill, but to erase. Ethan's body, destroyed, undone, still acted. His throat, raw and broken, tore open. "Hey." The figure didn't turn. The gun, a violent, electric crack. The camera, the lens, shattered. Glass exploded like a dying eye, jagged shards glinting before they hit the earth. The stranger's face, once cold, once unreadable, shifted. His eyes, narrow, sharp, flashed fire. But the phantoms were faster. A swift blow, metal, cold and hard, slammed into his ribs. The stranger's body folded, air escaping him in a silent gasp. His knees struck the earth, hard, and his body collapsed beside the broken fragments of his camera. But his hand, Ethan, saw it, amid the shattered glass. Fingers, bloodied, closed, around something small. A chip, the footage, the only witness. A boot, black, heavy, rose. Ethan's voice, raw and wild. "Don't." The boot fell, but not on his hand. The earth, beside it, crunched, and the phantom's voice, cold, synthetic, hissed through the mask. "Where is it?" The stranger, his face twisted in pain, smiled. The kind of smile a man gives when he knows that they can't take what he already owns. But the phantom's head, sharp, mechanical, turned back to Ethan. Ethan's heart, broken, battered, stopped, because the cold, glassy eye of the visor looked at him. The voice, flat and final. "If he won't give it, The weapon shifting. Maybe you will. The forest, timeless and ancient, held its breath. The forest fell wrong, violated. Its ancient heart, once a sanctuary of primal law and raw survival, had been shattered by the cold precision of men who did not belong. The air, thick with the wild's breath, now reeked of oil and metal. The wind, once a carrier of pine and earth, now carried only the mechanical whir of blades and the heavy crunch of boots, each step a foreign wound on the land. Ethan, his body a ruin of blood and bone, knelt in the earth's shattered cradle, cornered. His chest heaved, every breath a battle between pain and instinct. His ribs, cracked and splintered, flared with agony at every twitch. His arm, swollen and torn, hung useless at his side, his hand caked with blood and dirt. Yet, in his other hand, a fist, tight, unyielding. Inside it, nothing. But they didn't know that. The phantoms, the faceless men, clad in armor and shadows, believed. Their weapons, black and cold as the spaces between stars, were trained not on his body, but on his fist. Give it to us. The voice, mechanical, hollow, scrubbed of anything human, cut the air. The lead figure, visor black as a void, stood with the stillness of a loaded trigger, his rifle fixed on Ethan's chest. The others, shadows flanking shadows, mirror him in perfect, inhuman unison. But Ethan did not open his hand. The stranger, the man with the camera, now a figure collapsed and bleeding against the earth, lifted his head. His face, bruised and bloodied, cracked into something bitter, almost a grin. He knew. Ethan was stalling, but the phantoms did not care. The rifle, steady and cold, shifted by inches. Away from Ethan, to the stranger. The voice, flat and surgical. If not you. The trigger, tightening. Then him. Ethan's heart stopped. The stranger, eyes sharp even through the haze of blood and dirt, met Ethan's gaze. And in those eyes, so cold, so detached, Ethan saw something unexpected. A flicker, not of fear, but of acceptance. As if he knew, as if he always knew, that he wouldn't leave this forest. The phantom's finger began to pull, and Ethan moved. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, broken roar, as his shattered body lunged. His knee, fractured and screaming, collapsed. His shoulder, torn and ruined, gave. But his body, asterisk driven by something beyond pain, asterisk found the earth, his fingers, asterisk filthy, clawed, asterisk grabbing a splintered rock from the ground. The barrel of a gun, black, hollow, hungry, turned to him, and Ethan struck. The rock, connected, not with the man, but with his visor. The impact shattered. The glass, spider webbing with a screeching crack, exploded into shards, the splinters catching the light as if the forest itself were bleeding stars. The figure, caught in mid-trigger, reeled, his head snapping to the side as his balance broke. The gun, discharged. The sound, asterisk thunder and violence, asterisk shattered through the trees. But the bullet hit earth. The stranger, alive. Ethan, falling. His body crashed to the ground, a ruin of pain, his face pressed to the cold mud as blood from his temple mixed with the earth. His vision, fractured swimming, filled only with sky. And the sky was burning. The helicopter, hovering, circling, descended, the wind from its blades lashing through the trees, bending them into groans of protest. From its belly, a cable, a harness, a trap. The voice, sharp and absolute, boomed through the speaker, finality given form. Secure the target. The phantom, his visor shattered, his breath visible through the cracked mask, recovered. The rifle, rising again, and the others, closed in. Ethan's chest heaved. His vision, flickering, tunneling, began to darken. Is this where it ends? His fingers shaking, dug into the dirt, not from strength, but from something more primal. No, because Not like this. But then, a sound. Not the mechanical scream of a helicopter. Not the cold click of rifles. But a voice. A cry. The forest answered. From the trees, a deep, resonant rumble. The earth shifted. The phantoms, calibrated for men, for machines, stopped. Their heads turned. But Ethan already knew, because he felt it, before he heard it, the low, primal voice of the wild, the mother, the bear. The shadows between trees parted, and she came, a colossus of earth and fury, her form carved from every raw edge of nature itself, scarred, wounded, and unbroken. Her eyes found him, amber, burning, alive with knowing. But then they shifted to the men, and those eyes changed. The roar, when it came, was not a sound, it was a reckoning. The forest trembled. The men moved, but not fast enough. The bear struck, a blur of muscle and vengeance. Her body slammed into the nearest phantom with a force that broke the earth. The rifle, useless, was gone, crushed beneath her weight as the man's body, armored, armed, became fragile. The other phantoms reacted. The cold, hollow voice. Engage. Gunfire. The forest screamed, but the bear did not fall. Her body, thick with wounds and earth and blood, tore through the bullets, a force that felt older than the weapons that dared break her world. The phantoms scattered, their cold unity breaking into fear, their rifles flashing as they retreated. But the helicopter descended, the cable lowered, the claw reaching, but not for her. For him, Ethan felt it, the wind, the blinding light, the metal reaching, his body, too broken, too weak. And then the ground shook. A shadow covered him, not steel, but fur, heat. The bear, her body, colossal and torn, over him, her back, to the machine, her front, to the guns. The mother, Ethan, couldn't breathe because she was protecting him. Her cub was gone, but she chose him. The cable fired, a harpoon of steel, piercing the earth. But the bear moved. Her claws ripped. The line, the helicopter, lurched, the cable snapping back like a whip, tearing through the trees. But the phantoms recovered. The cold voice, take them both. The rifles aligned, the triggers pulled. But another sound, a new roar, not one, many. The trees shifted, and from the shadows, eyes, dozens, not man, not machine, wolves. The pack, the forest, fought back. The phalanx of predators, sleek and raw, burst from the trees, silent, fast, the air tearing with their speed. The guns turned, but too late. The wild defended its own. The phantoms fell. The rifles silenced. The machine panicked, the helicopter rotating, the pilot fighting. And then the mother bear rose, her body torn, her breath ragged, but her eyes alive. Ethan felt the weight of her shadow and the warmth, her body shielding him, but her eyes said something more, not rage, not vengeance, but goodbye. And then the blades, the rotor, the machine screamed, and the bear leaped, a force of nature, into the sky, and the helicopter, with her, fell. The fire tore the sky, the sound tore the world, the trees tore their roots, and the forest fell. The blast, a sun beneath the earth, and then only ash and silence. But from beneath the earth, breath, Ethan, alive, his eyes burning, his skin charred, his body wrecked, but alive, and the world was gone, except sound, crack, earth shifting, and of man closing on his wrist, and the voice of the stranger, "Get up." But as Ethan's eyes opened, saw her and the earth where she fell, but no body, only a track and a trail of blood into the trees, and Ethan's heart knew was still fighting. The earth was still burning. Ash, thick and heavy, clung to the air, each flake a ghost of something lost. The wind, once wild and free, carried the scent of scorched earth and shattered trees. The forest, ancient and proud, now lay wounded, its towering sentinels splintered and blackened, their crowns torn from the sky. Smoke crawled through the underbrush like a dying breath, curling against the cold, broken ground, and through it, a trail, dark, wet, red. Ethan's body, ruined, fractured, moved, not from strength, from something else. His knee, shredded and screaming, dragged through the dirt, every inch a promise of agony. His arm, barely clinging to the socket, trembled with the weight of his crawl. His breath, wet, sharp, rattling, was a fight he was losing. But his eyes saw the blood, a path, deep and raw, carve into the earth where massive paws had stumbled, where the forest's great colossus, the mother, had fallen, but not stopped, because there, amid the ruin, the marks did not end. They continued. She was still alive. His heart, broken, spent, seized with something fiercer than pain. She had given everything. Her body shielded him from death. Her rage tore through the men who have taken him. But now she was alone, wounded, bleeding, and dying. His voice, raw, cracked, broke through his torn throat. No, no, no. The ground, thick with ash and blood, swallowed his words. But moved. His body, shattered, refused. His bones, splintered, cried for mercy. His lungs burned. His vision flickered. But his soul did not yield. His fingers, filthy, bloodied, clawed the earth. His knee, grinding against gravel and soot, pushed. His teeth, gritted and fractured, bit through the agony. Because she did not stop for him, so he would not stop for her. The stranger's voice, harsh and sharp, cut the air behind him. Ethan. But Ethan didn't hear, didn't care. His world was only the trail, only her. The shadows, broken by the fire's orange glow, closed around him. The trees, maimed and skeletal, stood like silent mourners to the battle that had torn their roots. And the earth was red. The blood, hers, was thick, so thick. It painted his hands, his clothes, his heart. But still, it led, and he followed. Every breath, punishment. Every inch, torture. But every mark, a promise. And then a sound, so faint, but real. A breath, not his, and a whimper. His chest seized. His heart broke further, because it was hers. The mother was there. She lay, collapsed, against the trunk of a fallen pine, her massive frame heaving, her fur soaked and clotted with red, her side torn where the bullet had found her, her breath shallow, each exhale a fight, each inhale a war. But her head lifted, and her eyes found him, amber, fading, but alive. His chest caved with emotion, his lips, cracked and trembling, opened. I. But the word broke, because he saw that she knew her body would not rise again. Her strength was gone, but her eyes held him, as if to say, "You, alive." Ethan's face, filthy and torn, crumpled. His voice, fractured, begged, "No, no, 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 don't you?" His hands, weak, reached, his fingers pressing to the warm, thick fur, now drenched with her life. And the rumble, that soft, low sound, returned. A mother's voice, not in rage, not in war, but in peace. A sound that said, "I chose." And then her eyes began to close. Ethan, shattered, his hands clawed, as if he could keep her, as if he could give back the life she gave. But the wild does not return. Her breath slowed, her chest fell, and then stopped. The silence was a scream. Ethan broke. His forehead fell to her blood-warm fur, his body collapsing, his chest heaving, his soul undone. "Please," he whispered, his voice gone. "Don't leave me." But the wild had taken and left only him. The sob that tore from him wasn't human. It was animal. A sound from the core of loss, from the place that knows when something can never come back. But then a sound broke the grief, not from her, but behind him. Whimper, soft and small. His body froze, his breath stopped, and his head turned. The shadows shifted, and then shape, tiny, trembling, eyes wide, dark, and so lost. The cub, Ethan's heart, shattered again, but this time moved. His arm, torn, bloodied, reached. The cub stiffened, but then the eyes saw not threat, but grief that shared. The tiny form wavered, then collapsed against his hand. Ethan's body, already broken, broke more because the heartbeat, so small, pressed to his palm and was alone, but wasn't. His voice, a whisper to the wild, to her. I've got you." The cub trembled, but did not pull away, and the wild was silent, but watched and waited, because from the distance the rotors returned, and with them the cold of man. The wind carried ash and silence. The fire, once a monster devouring the sky, had choked on its own hunger. The smoke still crawled through the broken trees, clinging to the shattered earth like the breath of something dying but unwilling to leave. The forest, ancient, proud, now lay in ruin. What once was wild and untamed now felt empty, but not silent. A heartbeat, fragile, faint, remained. Ethan, his body, a wreckage of torn muscle and raw bone, lay half-buried beneath the ruin. His breath, shallow and broken, fought against the weight of the earth and agony pressing on his chest. His eyes, swollen, bloodied, barely open to the gray sky, where the smoke and clouds seemed to blend into one endless wound. But he wasn't alone. A warmth, small, trembling, pressed into his side. Soft fur, fragile breaths, alive. The cub, the tiny body, too weak to stand, clung to him, not from fear, but from something older than survival. The small, quivering form pressed against his ribs as if the heartbeat within him, the last thing still fighting, was the only thing that mattered. Ethan's lips, cracked and bleeding, trembled open. His voice, nothing but a breath, escaped. "I've got you." But the words were a lie, because he could feel it. The cold, not from the air, from within. His body giving, his skin fading. The forest, the pain, the cold, becoming distant. But then, the sound, the rotors returning, the mechanical thrum, a predator's growl from the sky, slicing through the broken silence. The helicopter, its metal belly dark and hungry, descended, its spotlight a cold spear of white through the smoke. And the shadows returned. Figures, faceless and armored, emerged from the ruin, their boots cracking through the blackened earth. Rifles, cold and ready, cut through the smoke like claws. Their visors dark, reflective, held no empathy, no humanity, only a mission. Ethan's body, barely more than ruin, reacted. His arm, numb, broken, moved, pressing the cub tighter to his chest. His fingers, raw and shaking, curled into the matted fur. Because he knew the weapons weren't for him. The voice, cold and surgical, split the air through a calm. Target acquired. But then, a new voice, sharp, tense. From the shadows, the stranger. No. The man who had once watched, once observed, now stepped forward, his body raw with dirt and blood, his face torn and bruised from the fight. But his voice, hard. Not them. The lead figure, visor black as the void, turned coldly. We are securing. But the stranger's voice, cut. No. He snapped, his breath sharp. You're taking. A pause, thin, cold, hung between them. The lead soldier raised his weapon. The stranger did not move, but his voice burned. You watched everything, but you. His voice cracked, and something new lived in it. You don't know what's here. The weapon aligned, but the stranger took a step. They fought. They bled. His eyes, cold no longer, blazed. And they, his voice broke, chose. The visor, empty of feeling, responded flatly. They're expendable. The shot echoed, but missed. Because the stranger's body took it. A crack, wet, sharp, tore through the air as his chest shattered, his body collapsing to his knees. Blood, dark and swift, poured through his fingers as they pressed to his side. But his eyes never left Ethan. Ethan tried to scream, but his voice was gone. The stranger's lips, cracked and bloodied, moved. Get up. The voice, weak, broken, but commanding. The phantom's rifle lifted again, but a sound, not a voice, but a roar. The earth shifted, and from the smoke, a shape, massive, but fallen. The mother, her body, a wreck, her side, torn, her breath, ragged, but her eyes were alive, and they saw the cub, Ethan's body, a ruin, tried and failed, but the cub moved toward her, tiny, trembling, but alive, and the mother rose, her frame broken, staggered, but moved, and phantoms turned, their weapons aligned, their command final. Take the shot. Ethan could not move, but his heart screamed no. The triggers pulled, but shadow crossed the body. The fire, not hers, but the stranger's, his body, a shield. The shots tore through him, but his eyes found Ethan one last time, and them promise take care of. But the words never finished. His body fell silent. The phantoms paused, but only for a second, because the mother moved with everything. Her claws met the steel. The phantoms fell one by one. The wild took back its own, and when the last soldier lay still, the mother turned. Ethan, her frame trembled, her breath shuddered, but her eyes saw him, and the cub at his side. Ethan could not speak, but his hand reached, and the mother came closer. Her muzzle touched his hand, and in that moment, everything was known. The choice, the trust, the bond, and then her eyes closed, her breath stopped. The forest fell silent, but the cub was alive. Ethan's body collapsed, but his hand never left Cub's side, and as the final rotors faded, the sky cleared. Dawn and the forest took them, not in death, but in memory, in the place where the wild never forgets.